Imagine a really quiet, typical two-lane residential street, the kind where kids are out riding their bikes and neighbors are like actually stopping to talk on the sidewalk.
Right, just a normal neighborhood?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But now imagine 1,000 cars suddenly tearing down that exact same street every single hour, just bumper to bumper, day after day.
Which is a nightmare.
Total nightmare. And why does it happen? Because some algorithm on a server 3,000 miles away decided that this one specific street was a 30-second shortcut around a traffic jam.
Yeah, happens all the time now.
It really does. So today, we're doing a deep dive into this profound, kind of quiet revolution happening globally in response to exactly that scenario. Cities are fundamentally redefining the very purpose of a street. Because for, the entire 20th century, the default assumption was just simple. Every single road had to serve moving vehicles.
Right, cars were the priority.
Always. But now we're seeing this massive shift toward a new model, this idea of resident-only access. And the stakes here are, they're massive for all of you listening, because this isn't just about managing traffic. It's really about reclaiming neighborhoods.
There's a huge shift in urban planning.
It is. We're basing this whole discussion on a really fascinating article from Podcaster Capital. It's titled, Trying to Drive Through Resident-Only Zones Without a Permit. Okay, let's unpack this. Why is this global shift happening right now?
Well, to understand how cities are fighting back, we really have to look at the three converging global pressures that essentially broke the modern neighborhood in the first place.
Right.
The first one is just safety. We are talking about narrow residential street spaces that often lack proper sidewalks or visibility, that simply present this unacceptable, completely measurable risk of collision when they're used as high-speed thoroughfares.
Because, when a driver is using a street as a shortcut, their primary goal is just speed.
Exactly. But the moment you remove that through traffic, collision rates just plummet.
Because it completely changes the psychology of the driver, right?
Yeah.
If you're only driving on that street because you actually live there or you're visiting someone who does, you naturally slow down. You aren't trying to beat a red light 3 miles away.
Yeah, you're navigating a destination, not a conduit.
That makes total sense.
And then the second pressure driving this shift is climate policy. We often fall into this trap of thinking the ultimate solution to transport emissions is just replacing every gas-powered car with an EV.
Which is everywhere in the news.
Right. But transport is notoriously difficult to decarbonize, and relying solely on EVs takes decades of infrastructure overhaul. So cities realize there's a much simpler, more immediate tool available to them. Just reduce the unnecessary driving distance.
Right, because if you make the shortcut impossible, people don't just magically find another longer detour.
Yeah.
A lot of times they just don't take the trip at all, or they hop on a bike or take the train.
That is the key mechanism. Resident-only zones don't just shift traffic from one street to another. By removing the structural incentives for driving, they actually eliminate a vast number of vehicle trips entirely.
Wow. Which brings us to the third pressure. And honestly, this is the one that really blew my mind reading the Podcaster Capital piece, because it affects almost everyone listening to this right now. The unintended side effects of digital navigation.
Oh, yeah, the algorithms.
Yeah, if you think about an algorithm in a navigation app that is ruthlessly optimizing for travel time, it's basically like water finding a crack in a foundation.
That is a perfect way to visualize it. The algorithm is entirely agnostic to the physical reality of the space.
It doesn't care if a street is a 6-lane commercial boulevard designed for heavy freight, or, a quiet lane right next to an elementary school. If it saves a commuter 30 seconds on their way home, the app just routes a regional flow of traffic right through a neighborhood. These apps have unintentionally turned quiet streets into invisible, high-speed, regional infrastructure. And the wild part is, tech companies did this.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, resident-only zones are essentially cities trying to rebalance public space against software routing.
Rebalance the space, right.
Because governance simply hadn't kept pace with the algorithms. Software silently redefined the city over the last decade. Now, the city is using physical policy to push back and say, no, this space is for living, not just for passing through.
So if software is this invisible, borderless enemy here, how on earth do physical cities structurally fight back? You can't just delete a navigation app from everyone's phone. And they certainly aren't building medieval stone walls around neighborhoods.
No, definitely not. And that is a crucial distinction to make. These resident-only zones are not gated communities. The physical space remains entirely open to pedestrians, to cyclists, and to essential services.
Okay, so you can still walk in?
Oh, absolutely. The fundamental shift is in the legal hierarchy. The streets are legally closed to non-local shortcut drivers. It forces the street to revert from a pipe meant for moving cars into a place meant for people.
Let's break down how this actually plays out on the ground. Because looking at the global response in the article, it is fascinating how different cultures approach this exact same problem. Like, take Amsterdam.
Right. Amsterdam is a great example.
The operational concept there is guest traffic. The car is still allowed, but it's treated strictly as a visitor in a pedestrian's domain. And they use specific physical engineering to enforce this.
Yes, and it's highly effective. They utilize narrow carriageways and something called shared surfaces.
I want to pause on that because it's such a brilliant psychological trick. A shared surface basically means they remove the curbs entirely. The sidewalk and the street are at the exact same level, often paved with the exact same brick.
The distinction is just gone.
So as a driver, you instinctively feel like you've just driven your car onto a pedestrian plaza. It physically feels wrong to go fast.
Your brain instinctively tells you to hit the brakes. The design of the street itself makes driving intentionally inconvenient. It's physical engineering reinforcing the legal rule. Then, if we travel over to Barcelona, they have engineered a much more systemic approach.
Oh, the superblocks.
It's exactly known as the superblock revolution.
The superblocks are incredible. It's basically taking a 9-block grid, so 3 blocks by 3 blocks, and fundamentally changing the flow.
Exactly. They route all the heavy, fast-moving vehicle traffic to the perimeter roads of that 9-block area.
Keeping the inside protected.
Right. The interior streets are then prioritized strictly for walking, cycling, and very slow local access. You physically cannot drive straight through the center of a superblock.
Wow.
And the outcome of that structural change has been a measurable, drastic improvement in local air quality and a massive reduction in ambient city noise.
But, not every city has the perfect grid system of Barcelona to work with. Look at the contrast between Tokyo and Vienna.
That's a really interesting comparison.
Yeah, because Tokyo operates on what we can call an accidental model. They didn't necessarily have to pass sweeping legislative bans to keep cars from speeding through neighborhoods. The urban form itself is just so incredibly narrow and winding that it acts as a natural regulation.
It forces you to slow down.
Right. The geometry of the city does the heavy lifting, forcing drivers to be cautious because the environment constantly communicates vulnerability.
Vienna, on the other hand, takes a much more subtle path. We can think of it as quiet regulation.
Quiet regulation, I like that.
Yeah, instead of dramatic, highly visible transformations like a superblock, Vienna uses incremental policy layering. They might add a slow zone on one block, tweak parking controls on the next, and restrict turning access on a few key corners.
So it's death by 1,000 cuts for the shortcut.
Basically. Over time, the cumulative effect is a massive citywide limitation of through traffic, but they achieve it without the visible lightning rod conflict that you see in other places.
Which naturally brings us to London, where they definitely did not avoid conflict.
No, they certainly did not.
London introduced low traffic neighborhoods, or LTNs. It was one of the largest modern experiments in filtered access, using cameras and physical planters to block through traffic. And it sparked massive, intense political debate.
Huge backlash.
Yeah, neighbors were arguing at town halls. It was a huge point of contention. But the data showed that it successfully reduced traffic inside the zones and led to a significant increase in cycling and walking.
What's fascinating here is that the sheer intensity of the controversy in London revealed a much deeper truth about our cities. Streets are not just asphalt, they are emotional infrastructure.
Emotional infrastructure.
Yeah. We don't just use them to get from point A to point B. We feel a deep sense of ownership and entitlement over them. So when a local government changes how a street functions, they are touching a very raw nerve in the public consciousness.
Okay, so if cities are implementing these zones, and as we established, they aren't building giant stone walls to keep non-residents out, how do they practically enforce this? Here's where it gets really interesting, because the visual of this is so striking. Imagine a leafy, nighttime residential street, and rising silently out of the cobblestones are these glowing blue, retractable metal cylinders. Smart bollards.
That image really encapsulates the new urban philosophy perfectly. Those smart bollards represent flexible boundaries rather than permanent walls.
Right.
They physically block unauthorized cars from entering a street, but they can drop flush into the ground in a matter of seconds for a resident returning home or, a delivery truck with a scheduled drop-off.
But the heavy lifting isn't just done by metal posts in the ground. I mean, you can't put a bollard on every single corner of a major city. There's a whole invisible digital toolkit at work here.
That's right. The modern resident-only zone relies heavily on software-driven governance. A massive component of this is license plate recognition, or LPR cameras.
Like invisible fences.
Think of them exactly like invisible fences. They monitor vehicles entering a restricted street in real time. If your license plate isn't registered with a permit, you don't get pulled over by a police officer. There is no physical friction at all. You just receive an automatic fine in the mail a few days later.
And this all pairs with digital permits, right? Residents can just go online, register their family's cars, and even grant temporary access windows for an electrician or a grocery delivery.
Exactly. It's a dynamic, digitally managed boundary.
Okay, I have to jump in here on behalf of anyone listening who is immediately skeptical of this.
Yeah.
Wait, if we block off streets with bollards and cameras, aren't we delaying ambulances and firefighters? Isn't that dangerous? Like in a life or death emergency?
It is absolutely the most common concern raised when these zones are proposed, and frankly, it is highly intuitive. A physical barrier looks like a delay, but the empirical data across these cities is emphatic on this point. The evidence consistently shows the exact opposite.
Wait, really? How is that possible?
Well, first, emergency vehicles are legally exempt from these restrictions everywhere. That is the baseline. But practically speaking, those smart ballers are directly integrated with emergency transponders. As a fire truck approaches, the baller drops automatically. Furthermore, the navigation databases that ambulance drivers and dispatchers use integrate these access rules in real time.
So the ambulance's GPS already knows the exact open route, and it knows it won't be penalized by the camera.
Precisely. They retain direct, unobstructed routes. And here is the truly counterintuitive finding less shortcut congestion, and fewer illegally parked cars actually improve emergency response reliability.
Because there's no traffic.
Think about it. An ambulance cannot get through a narrow residential street that is completely gridlocked with 50 commuters trying to bypass a highway. There is nowhere for those cars to pull over. But if you remove those commuters, the ambulance flies down an empty street, the baller drops, and they arrive faster.
That makes perfect sense when you visualize it. An empty street with a smart barrier is much faster to navigate than a street jammed with impatient drivers. Also, the article mentions the Universal European 112 emergency system operates entirely independently of these local access restrictions, ensuring that safety remains non-negotiable.
Exactly. Safety is hard-coded into the design.
But if emergency response times actually improve, and the streets get measurably safer for pedestrians and kids, why do people fight these policies with such intense passion? I mean, we saw it in London. It gets incredibly heated.
This raises an important question, and it is really the crux of the entire global debate. Who owns the street? Is it everyone in the city who might need to pass through it, or is it the people actively living on it?
And we really need to look at both sides of this ideological resistance impartially to understand the friction. Because for a lot of people, the automobile has spent an entire century symbolizing pure, unadulterated freedom.
Oh, absolutely. The open road.
Yeah, the open road is a powerful cultural concept. So when a local government steps in and says you cannot drive your car here, it feels deeply personal. It feels like a restriction of liberty, even if the rule applies universally to everyone outside that neighborhood.
The critics present several very real structural arguments, too. They argue that these policies don't magically eliminate all traffic. They often just displace it onto other, wider arterial roads, making the traffic worse for the people who live there.
Right, the displacement effect.
Yeah. They argue that overall accessibility to the city decreases, making life harder for tradespeople or folks with long commutes. And perhaps most importantly, there is a significant concern that these policies inherently favor affluent areas.
Yeah.
The fear is that wealthier neighborhoods get the quiet, pristine streets, while lower-income communities living on the perimeter roads are forced to bear the brunt of the displaced exhaust, noise, and congestion.
It's a very valid concern. But the proponents of these zones counter that argument by pointing to the historical context we talked about earlier. They argue that unmanaged algorithmic traffic forced a massive regional burden onto residential streets without the residents' consent.
Right.
Essentially, they ask, why should a local neighborhood be forced to absorb the mobility flows of an entire metropolitan region just because a tech company's app found a 30-second shortcut?
It's a profound friction between regional efficiency, getting everyone to work as fast as possible, and local livability.
And what about the economics of it all? That is another major flashpoint at city council meetings. The immediate assumption is usually that if cars disappear from a street, Local small businesses will die because no one can drive right up to the storefront to buy things.
The economic findings actually run completely contrary to those fears. Neighborhoods that implement restricted through traffic consistently report increased local retail activity.
Why? That seems backwards.
Because local businesses actually benefit from slower environments. When people are walking or cycling, they linger. They look in windows. They spontaneously stop at a cafe or a bookstore.
Right. They're not just zooming past.
Exactly. When people are speeding by at 35 miles an hour trying to beat the next red light on their commute, they don't stop. They are just passing through. Additionally, property values in these zones tend to stabilize, and the city itself saves millions in maintenance because infrastructure wear and tear goes down dramatically when you remove thousands of heavy vehicles pounding the pavement daily.
But to address the earlier point about affluent areas, cities have to be incredibly careful with equity, right? This can't just be a luxury for the rich.
Absolutely not. The entire system falls apart if it becomes exclusionary. To work, cities must design exemptions properly. There is an absolute necessity for exemptions for disabled residents who rely on point-to-point car transport, for local delivery workers, and for the seamless integration of public transport.
It has to be accessible.
Right. Mobility has to be treated as a comprehensive service ecosystem, not a blunt binary restriction. If a city just throws up a ban without providing alternatives, it fails. If it manages the ecosystem thoughtfully, it thrives.
So what does this all mean? We've looked at the history of the shortcut, the physical mechanics of bollards and cameras, the fierce debates over freedom, and the economic realities. Where is this all heading? What is the ultimate outcome for the city of tomorrow?
The horizon line here is the concept of the programmable street. We are currently witnessing the birth of adaptive urban infrastructure. Right now, a street is generally either open or closed. It's a static rule, but future systems will be highly dynamic.
Okay, how so?
Imagine street access that shifts based on the time of day. Completely open for morning commercial deliveries, but strictly closed to non-residents during afternoon school dismissal to protect children walking home.
Or even restrictions triggered by environmental sensors.
Exactly. Pollution-triggered restrictions. If local air quality drops below a certain healthy threshold on a hot summer day, the digital permits could temporarily pause non-essential vehicle access until the air clears. We are moving toward AI-assisted traffic redistribution. The physical street itself essentially becomes a programmable piece of software.
And while that technology is incredibly cool, the most profound takeaway from all of this, for me, wasn't the AI or the smart bollards or the cameras. It was the psychological shift that happens to the people living there.
Yeah, the human element.
Exactly. When you read about these transformations, they paint this vivid picture of what happens when the constant underlying hum of engine noise finally vanishes. Suddenly, human conversations become audible across the street. Outdoor life returns to the front stoop. Kids play outside again. What looks on paper like a very dry, boring municipal traffic policy is, in reality, a masterclass in social architecture.
It is a deliberate choice to rediscover the oldest, most fundamental function of a city facilitating human interaction.
It really is. To recap our journey today for you listening, we are witnessing a massive global shift. From designing cities around the movement of cars to redesigning them to serve human life. The realization here is that the next generation smart city isn't necessarily going to focus on moving everyone faster. Instead, it's going to intelligently decide who actually needs to move and how to protect the spaces where people live.
Which leaves us with a fascinating implication to consider. If our streets are actively becoming these dynamic, software-driven spaces that open and close based on AI, pollution triggers, and algorithmic routing, will our physical neighborhoods eventually feel like digital subscription services, where your physical access to the world is dictated by an algorithm rather than a map?
Wow, that is definitely something to chew on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Next time you look out the window at the street in front of your house, try to look at it a little differently today. See you next time.